channel, SouthWood Designs. I'm David, and today we're going to turn this into this. This is the first part of a number of videos that I'm going to do to go through the process changing this pile of timber or lumber into a fully functional and very effective workbench. The Optimum Workbench, I'm going to call it the Optimum Workbench, because for me that is optimum. It suits the space, and from a design point of view it's covered all the bases that I've set out so that I can have this one-stop workbench, the Optimum Workbench. So let's kick off with the first part of the build.
So I thought a lot about this build. I looked at different ways of putting particularly the frame together, and one of the earlier thoughts that I had based on a couple of videos that I'd seen on YouTube were having the main beams in three pieces. So I've just got a mock together here so that you can see what I was thinking of doing. Three pieces at about 30 millimeters each width, so that would end up being 90, and screw and glue together, and a gap in the middle there, and that would form this cross piece here. And then the legs were going to be a piece like this, again 3 pieces screwed and glued together, and one would sit up inside the other. Let's just hope that's going to go in there. So one would sit up inside the other. It actually makes for a very strong bond, but you'd have left and right support, you'd have front and back support, and it becomes quite a strong join for holding pieces together. But in the end, what I did was just 2 pieces, 45 millimeters by 90 millimeters, and I did the joins like this. So uprights like so, cross pieces like so, and one sits across the other like that, and screwed and glued. Because it's fairly chunky timber, it just worked pretty well. So that was one of the things that I thought about when I was working through the design. I changed a lot of things along the way in terms of where I'd positioned certain pieces and so on. And that's just the nature of building something like this. That's what happens when you're part way along and you think, I thought it was going to work out like this, but I think it works better that way instead. And so I went back, changed the plans, make sure that they worked well on the plans, and then put it into practice. So here we go, the build. And these are the only 4 straight pieces out of the batch of 19 4x2s that are 2.4 meters long. So 90 mils by 45 mils in metric terms, 2400 long, and so 2x4s in the old language, and 8 foot long. The only 4 straight pieces that didn't have knots in them, and those are forming the front and back, top and bottom main rails. And what I'm doing here, just based on what I mentioned previously, was building the framework and building these pieces around the framework to hold the cross pieces and the legs together. So clamping, as you can see there, just makes it a little easier and a little more accurate in measuring up, and using your one control piece and then following that through to all of the others. So I've got all the pieces cut, nicely measured and nicely straight, and the next stage is going to be the glue up that's going to put all the subsections together on the main frame lengths. Now you'll notice here on the lengths I'm screwing the support pieces on the inside. These will end up being the inside of the main frame. But on the legs, so that's the shorter length that I'm screwing there, but on the legs I'll be putting the screws in on the outside. I'm doing the screws and the glue instead of clamps. It's just a lot easier, and I haven't got a massive number of clamps. It is just easier to screw and glue, and you can then carry on working rather than waiting for the glue to set and dry, which may be more practical in a smaller number of pieces. So make sure, again, just using your time efficiently and cutting those lengths all together, and makes for an easier job overall. Now, having screwed and glued the main long pieces, the main support framework, these are the legs that I'm doing now, and Same thing, screwed and glued, clamping together, because you can see I'm just flipping it over there, and I'll screw it up on the outside of these, and these will end up being on the inside of the body of the framework, so you're not going to see the screws that are put on the outside. It'll all fall into place. You'll see in a few more minutes when I get to the point where I'm putting the framework together. Just using a mini roller there to spread the glue, it just makes it a lot quicker, a lot easier. Little edge paint roller, but there's a lot available in the pack. They're quite reasonable, and it doesn't matter if you burn a few of those when you're going through, and makes it a lot quicker to glue in bulk as we're doing here. Right, so that's all of the joining of the pieces. You can see all the framework there, the 4 lengths, and then I think I've got 7 or 8 uprights there, the leg sections. And I'm using this garage floor because it's a lot flatter than that level outside. Checking both corners are equal and check that they're nice and square, which they should be. There you go, even got the thumbs up to prove it. And then using the square again to make sure that all corners are as they should be and nice and square. So I'm using bigger hex head screws here to join these pieces together, fairly bulky. So yeah, the big debate, do I go 1 metre wide or 1 metre 20, 3'3" or 3'11"? I had scope to do both, and I initially did the plans for 1 metre wide, but I thought, you know what, it's another 20 centimetres. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a bit like the difference between a queen bed and a king bed. So I decided to go the full 120. So now here we're doing the framework for the joining section between the 2 main frames using the Craig pocket hole jig there, doing all of these in one hit, just saves time. Vacuum, it's such a difference. If you put the vacuum hose on the side, it holds it all together nicely. So now screwing in these pocket holes, you can see the framework is starting to come together nicely there, and starting to form the shape of how it's going to look overall. So pocket hole screws are pretty effective, 2 in each, and the 4 framework pieces along the bottom, and then I'll end up with 4 framework pieces across the top, but they will vary across the top compared to the bottom, because I'm going to have the table saw sitting in this front section here. In fact, you can see the legs slightly differently spaced apart in this front section, just where that table saw is going to go. Starting to get quite heavy now. The timber's quite chunky. It's pine, but it's quite chunky, and the whole unit is starting to get quite heavy and cumbersome. But I'll put some little big actually, chunky casters on it soon, just so it'll be easy to move around. There we go, that's the casters now. So on each corner, on the 4 corners, I've got the lockable casters, and then the 2 in the middle are non-lockable but free-moving casters. Screwed in with decent screws to hold them in tight, because they're going to take a lot of strain when you're pushing this thing around. And then just flip it over and get the other ones in. These casters hold 125 kilos each, I think it is, or thereabouts. And again, I just figured it made sense to go with something more sturdy, particularly when you get the weight of the timber, and then you get a few of the bigger tools sitting on as well. Righto, give it a little flip, and over onto the casters, eventually. Just on a couple of cracks in the garage there, but that's okay. And moves around quite nicely and quite freely. So what we're doing here now is measuring out this while it's sitting on the top. It's actually the piece that's going to sit on the base. I decided rather than do subsections I decided to do just one large piece. So I'm cutting out, it's going to sit right flush with the outside of the full lengths rather than on the inside. And I just felt that it'll be better to do one large piece, give it a bit more stability. Actually, still haven't screwed that down, but I will do once it's in place. And then any drawers that I'll build, which will come in a subsequent video, they'll sit on top of that. The framework will sit on top of that, but it just makes for, again, more sturdiness with the base at the bottom as well as the section, the table at the top. So I'm marking those out, and I've cut them out already with the jigsaw. You can see the gaps there, making sure that they all line up. And then I realized that it's not going to quite slip under because of the angle with that cross piece, so I removed the cross piece and then just gently eased it in place, and there we go. Another thumbs up. Got to be a perfect fit. So measuring out now the section that's going to be the framework to sit the table saw on. The insides are give or take about 1 metre wide. The outsides will be 120 because the timber's 90 wide. So I think it's about 118 wide altogether. So I'm just using brackets to hold a piece of timber so I can fit these cross struts on, which again are fitted with the pocket hole screws. Nice chunky timber so you can get decent lengths of screws in. That's going to hold it quite well. It's not going to take a huge amount of weight, but nonetheless, where it's spread across the two main braces there, it's certainly going to be sufficient to hold. The table saw is not a massive one. It's actually one that sits on a tubular frame at the moment. It's quite a mobile one. It's on wheels. Nice tight fit there, just using a bit of ingenuity to get it together. And now I'm just cutting out the piece that's required to remove for the table saw in the top section, and that actually will form the shelf at the bottom.
We've got ourselves some T-track, 5 lengths actually, at just over 1 metre 20, just over 4 feet, that's going to run like this. 1, 2, and then that one just there, and that one is going to go back there. This one's for a bit later on, we'll cover that in a bit. So I've already started covering this. I put a coat of lacquer over this yesterday, and I've decided that I'm going to cut the T-track first, then I'll be able to lacquer inside the grooves and do the second coat, and I'll end up doing 3 coats altogether on this. But I wanted to cut the T-track in first, just so that I can make sure that I don't go ruining the finish that I put on to protect this investment that we've got that's going to last well into the future and provide us many hours of great woodworking and projects. So let's start to cut some grooves. Bit scary because you only get one shot at it and you can't screw it up, but if you take your time and make sure that you measured it out correctly, always measure 2 or 3 times and then cut once, then you know that it's going to work well. So let's get to preparation.
So now measuring out where the lines on the table are going to go that I'm going to route out for the T-track. Actually using the T-track as a template, nice and even all the way through. I realised, and I've mentioned this elsewhere, but I realised that I should have had a groove of 2 pieces of track and not just the one. It's being done in 3 passes. I'm going quite shallow because it's 19 mils wide, so 3/4 of an inch wide. I do turn the router off when I stop it, as I did just then, by the way. And a lot of dust coming out. Unfortunately, I did have a little bit of, not blowout, but it was just not quite as secure as it could have been if I had a piece of support on the other side as well, a rail on the other side. But you know, you live and learn. That's just the way it is. Quick bit of patching and it fixed that up quite easily. Again, turning the router off when I stop it there, cleaning up in between, dust everywhere. It's just, MDF is a shocker. So three runs through. I think I only filmed 2 out of the 3, but 3 runs through to get that groove in nice and deep, you can just see a little bit of the chop out in that front left-hand section of the one that I've just done. Okay, so routing is done, and now I'm onto a bit of sanding. I've already done one coat on this, but I ran the T-track grooves through, and now just sanding on both surfaces, the top and the bottom section here. And it just very light, you know, 240 grit, so it's a very fine sandpaper using the sander there, and it didn't take long to do. But the idea of that is it just makes it for a better finish overall, and it lets the next coat sit nicely on it and gets rid of any imperfections that might have been there. Slightly damp cloth just to clean it off. Brisbane, Australia, so even though it's into winter, it's pretty warm. It's mid to late 20s here. It'll dry out in a very short space of time. You can see it drying out there actually as we speak. So it's not a problem at all, but I did leave it a little while to dry to make sure that there was no dampness at all. So what we're doing here is cutting the T-track using the table saw. It's quite effective, quite safe. It's a light aluminium, so the blade goes through nicely. Just measuring each section and cutting it to length. And where the piece is fresh on each end, the colour, the orange, not the blue, but the colour shows right the way through to the end. But where I cut it, it's that aluminium colour. So I'm putting the actual colour piece at the end, so it looks nice and finished, and then the cut piece is in the middle. I decided not to buy the T sections where the T-track intersects, because I'm leaving a square there so that part way through the table, if I want to put one of the screws in or one of the bolts in, it's a lot easier than coming up to one end or the other. Whereas those T or those X intersections that you can buy actually do block off that point where the T-track intersects. So just a little tip, a little hint. I think it might have been Travis on Shop Nation that mentioned that when he was doing something on one of his many tables that he's built. And it just makes for easier insertion, as I said, of the bolts. So once each piece is cut, I then screwed them in, which I'll do shortly. Just about to give it a little knock in with a block of wood to make sure that they're all sitting down. A couple of them are just raised slightly. It's a pretty tight groove, 19 mils. Not a bad thing, it just holds it in there nicely. And there we go, screwed and in place. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is setting in the router using this piece of polycarb. It's bigger than we need, so I'm going to cut a piece out that's 200 by 200. You can use a bandsaw or hand saw or whatever on this, so it's quite easy. I use the table saw. I think that should be okay. I've got enough here to do a test just in case. So 200 square, and I'll remove this plastic, this piece here, plastic. Yes, it is plastic. And I'm going to replace it with this so that this then becomes a bigger base. Cut a hole in here. Inset it using the router and a frame, a hole that's 200 by 200 so that this screws on top of this, and this will then sit inside the hole nicely. There's nothing underneath, and I've got these rails here, that, this T-track that we can use. I'll also build a jig that will be able to be fitted on this out of a piece of hardwood that I've got, and that'll just make life a whole lot easier in using this router. So let's crack on. Excuse the noisy birds in the background, but that's okay, all good. Just did a test and you can still hear me talking, which may or may not be a good thing. Anyway, we'll see, depends on how many people like this video. So I'm building this template here, this jig that I'm going to use to cut out the hole that the router is going to sit in. Once I've fitted the perspex to it, used pocket hole screws to join them together. I'll actually keep this for another project down the track. It might be useful, but it was just something that was quite straightforward to put together. Just checking the measurements there, the depth of the router piece, because I need to route to the depth of the piece of Perspex. Getting the vacuum ready because, as I said before, MDF is messy and gets really, really dusty. Now, a slight little mistake there, or faux pas, as they say. I'm going backwards, not forwards. There's a certain way to go, and that's more like it. You need to go clockwise around the timber, but anyway, that's all right. And I ran this in a couple of passes with an adjustment of the pieces and the router piece, the router bit. And then I've just screwed 4 holes, and I'm cutting out now using the jigsaw and just cutting around that edge to finish it off nicely. Everything's finishing off nicely, it seems. So that's cut out, vacuum up the dust and the residue and a quick bit of a sand, and happy days, good to go. So I got the Perspex, marking it out with a marker. Cut it out already, did that off screen, and I've just rounded the edges off because from the router bit, it's made rounded edges in that gap. And unscrewing now the top of the existing router, that plastic piece, and setting it out to mark where the holes are going to go to replace the piece that was on the original router with this new Perspex piece. Just initially marking with just a slight touch of the screwdriver, the drill there, putting it in place and drilling 4 holes through, and then finding the right hole size, which is about 32 mils from memory, or 1 1/4 inch, I think, in the old language. So just fitting that hole saw and drilling through that Perspex, and that will be the replacement for what was on the existing router. So it fits quite well. I countersunk those holes as well. I did that off video, and so it just allows the screws to sit in as they were before on a smaller bit of plastic, and it's sitting well. So now we're going to fit the shelf that the miter saw is going to sit on. Just putting another piece of framework in, another bit of bracing across the top. I looked at a number of different ways of doing this. I thought about doing a cantilever system where I can just flip the saw round, the miter saw round, so it stores underneath and then flips up again. But I decided that I might well use this shelf for a number of things rather than just the miter saw. I'll end up building a base for the Craig jig to sit on, for example, because once this is fitted in place, and I'm just starting to fit that first part of the shelf now, once this is fitted in place, then it'll have the 4 bolts sticking up, and that'll allow me to be able to use it for a number of other things. So another example of changing part the way through, just checking for the height to make sure all is good. And the 4 bolts that I will put in, you'll see that in a little bit, I'll be able to just screw those down nicely. Nicely again. How many times have I used the word nicely? Mention in the comments. Actually don't, might be embarrassing. So I'll be able to, I'm just marking those 4 points now, and I'm putting those screws in on a separate piece of wood, and that will then attach to the lower piece of wood that's just underneath there, and hold that in place. So it'll keep the piece of equipment, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a miter saw or a Craig jig or whatever, it'll keep that in place and stop it moving around, keep it safe. Now the idea of this too is that with the miter saw, you might have a long piece that you want to cut, and there's a good at least half the length of the workbench to your left, my right. So I might have a long piece that I'm cutting on the miter saw. That's fine, the table will be support for that. I'm just getting that height right to make sure that when the miter saw is in place, that the table will be the remaining support for long pieces that are there. These screws are in little screw lug pieces that I fitted in. There we go, that's sitting on there now. Just getting in position to make sure that the front adjustment is going to work. Then, because there's a front adjustment to change the angle from 90, 45 degrees, 0, etc. So just getting that in place. And so there's a little shelf in the front for the 4 locking lugs to sit. Now what I need to do, and another scary bit, but got to be done, is working out where I'm going to cut the top section of this bench, the MDF, and remove, to allow me to remove that piece and allow access to the piece that I've just built. So getting everything ready here, cutting it inside this time where the floor is flatter. You can see I've got the table saw just the length of the blade, or the depth of the blade rather, is just enough. Oh, better put the safety stuff on, better late than never. The depth of the blade is just enough to cut through the MDF. So it's a pretty squeezy, but it does work nonetheless. Still, it keeps the grooves for the sled, for the table saw. It's not going to interrupt those. There's enough space there. Taking it nice and slowly to make sure that I get it right the first time. Dust everywhere, incredible. So one thing I work on a future build is dust extraction. At the moment, I'm just using the vacuum loose and attaching it to various tools as I can. So fitting a little piece on here, and that little piece will allow that tabletop that I've just cut out to sit in just like that. So that's the build in terms of stage one. There's more stages to come. I'm going to put some shelves in and some other fancy bits and pieces to make this a lot more functional. It's already pretty functional now. I'm pretty happy with the way this is sliding through and beyond. I've got this lift up section here, and this piece will just pop underneath, and then the miter saw will just sit on top of these 4 bolts that are sitting up, and they'll be screwed. The miter saw will be screwed in place with these little securing pins and stop that moving around, and then back to a nice flat surface once the miter saw is away. The channeling is good, not your usual blue that you often see, but nonetheless it does the job. 19 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch wide and about 1/2 an inch deep, I think from memory, or about 11 or 12 millimeters. A couple of things I learned here was when you're doing with a 6.5 millimeter width shank in a router, you need to do 3 or 4 passes, and I learned that the hard way, and I've got a couple of things that I need to patch up here because the router got away from me, and that's because I was trying to go too deep too fast, and you've just got to take it easy. So 3 or 4 passes, no issue with that. The other thing that would have helped was having a twin channel for the router to run through and not just one. That would have stopped a bit of blowout or runoff. But all in all, it's come along pretty nicely. So this is the first stage, as I said, of the multi-stage of the Optimum Workbench, and I'll continue to build and design some more. Again, I keep on changing what I want to do, but I'll keep on designing some more and then come out with another video for stage 2 of this Optimum Workbench. So I hope you've liked what you've seen so far. If you do, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. That'll be great, and certainly that would be a big help. And I appreciate that you've taken the time to have a look at this and see how things are made from effectively a home handyman that just likes making stuff. So thanks again, and really appreciate your support, and look forward to seeing you at the next video. Cheers. Because what you've got is support left. Oh, that's not supposed to happen because it'll be screwed and glued together. Didn't see that, did you?